you don't have to exchange your entire fleet with hydrogen or electric trucks. There are also a lot of intermediate steps which can be taken.
Hello, and welcome to Speaking of Supply Chain, where we explore trends, current events, and innovations impacting the logistics and supply chain industries. I'm your host, Ellen Wood. Today, I'm excited to be joined by my colleague, Jakob Stary, and we are going to be talking about various ecological improvements and sustainable practices for the logistics industry when it comes to transportation and warehousing that have gained traction in the past years. Jakob, welcome. How are you today?
I'm very good.
So we are going to get into this very, very relevant topic here in just a minute. But let's take a quick break and get to know you a little bit more. So for our icebreaker today, if you could learn one new professional skill instantly, what would it be?
Definitely learning a new language, because I think it's always great in my personal life. If I'm abroad, if I'm traveling, it's great to have that interaction. But also thinking about a professional, it's a very great professional skill. If we go to warehouses in different countries, it's great to interact with people also in the local language.
Yeah, it does make communication so much easier. So I know you speak German and English. You're already bilingual. Do you speak any other languages already?
I'm learning Spanish currently.
Learning Spanish. Okay. Is that the only one you would learn instantly, or is there another one that you've always wanted to learn?
I think Spanish would be the top one. I think it would be really cool to speak another language which is completely from a different culture. Thinking about Chinese, for example.
Yeah, that would be a good one.
Because that would, or Japanese, South Korean, because the interaction you can have then with the people from these countries is completely different.
So I took Spanish in school, throughout school. And at one point I would have considered myself bilingual, but I haven't used it in so many years. And I know we do have colleagues in our Latin offices that I could speak Spanish with, but it is so far gone at this point that I probably could not manage it. I can listen to it, but I can't think fast enough to speak it anymore.
Yeah, definitely.
But I've picked up some phrases. I remember it was almost 20 years ago now that I went on a trip to Italy, and I wanted to pick up some Italian. And because I had the basis from Spanish, which is a Latin-based language, I was able to pick up Italian really quickly at the time. And I learned enough Italian to get by. And it was a lot of fun to be able to do that and to speak with people in the native language. And I know some countries are more forgiving of people trying to speak their language and butchering it horribly. But the Italians were incredibly generous, and they loved that even though we were there only for a week, that I had bothered to try, because most of the time tour groups like that, no one does. So that was a lot of fun.
And they really appreciate that.
Yeah.
Just the effort you make on vacation, but also again in the business life. So when we are in the warehouse in another country, and I don't know, we're in Poland, then often people then speak English or even rather German, the line workers, than English. And of course, it would be great to have that conversation from my side as well in Polish, because then it would be a completely different interaction.
Yeah, I would probably have a much easier time in a lot of ways if I also spoke German.
I guess so.
All right, let's get back to our topic today. So, you've been with Miebach for a handful of years. What is it, 6 now?
No, Alan, I have to correct you there. I'm with Miebach full time since 3 years. I did an internship back in the days in the US, and therefore probably the longer. I think it was in 2018.
Yeah, it seems like forever ago, but yeah, it has been a long time. And I know you have got a ton of experience since you have been a full-time colleague in the Munich office, correct?
Exactly.
Okay. And sustainability is one of your passions.
Yeah. during my studies, during my master's degree, which I did in between Miebach internship in US and Miebach full time now in Germany, we also had a topic about or a lecture about sustainability, and that was really interesting. So sustainability only focused on logistics. And thereby I got a little bit into the topic. Then I did an internship for Doctors Without Borders, focusing again there on sustainability part. I don't have a medical degree. So sustainability in transportation, because of course all the medication also needs to go somewhere. And after that, sustainability was part of my logistics competence. And with starting in Miebach, I pushed for that topic, and I'm happy to be able to push that also in projects and help colleagues globally when these questions appear.
Yes. So it's become such a big topic. So last year in 2023, we talked with Anastasia and about some of the legal parameters being set in place for supply chains. We were talking about the governance that was coming through. Germany was the first to adopt it. I know that the European Union is still working on some of those governances that they're putting into place for all logistics companies or for all companies that have logistics operations. But you've got some really specific solutions that we're going to talk about today about implementing those initiatives. So it's great to have obviously something in place where everyone has a level playing field. You know, we know what the expectation is. That doesn't mean that it's necessarily the easiest thing or the most natural thing to just fall into. You know, these are big changes for some of these companies when it comes to their transportation and facilities. So are companies starting to be more proactive about these concepts, or is it still very reactive to, you know, a law coming into practice, or keeping up with their competition? What is the impetus that gets companies more aware of it and that it needs to be something they should do?
Mm-hmm. I would say a little bit of everything. So when we look at the market, what do we see is we definitely have some early adopters. They are pushing for the topic. It's part of their culture. And I mean, not from a marketing perspective, but they're really living it. Because of course everybody says we are green and we want to push sustainability, and then of course that we have other companies who are following then these early adopters, who are more pushed through governance, through regulations, and also aiming a little bit more for the financial benefits some of these solutions might also enable. But yeah, if we look at the market, and that's also what we see in the past years in our project, is that we see a clear trend towards more sustainability. So my specialty within Miebach is network design, and if I talk to my colleagues who are longer than myself within the company, let's say 5 years ago, sustainability wasn't a topic at all, and it was not requested at all. And now it's very rare that we do a network study where we don't touch sustainability at some point. It's not that it's the main topic, but definitely in every network study we calculate the emissions, and it's now becoming part of the decision tree. So before it was only cost and service level, and now it's emissions are part of the decision-making process, which is great because we see this trend toward it. And we also had really now our first project, which are focusing purely on green topics, so sustainability, also network studies, not whole network studies, and that's something what we can do with our simulation softwares, that we can optimize by cost, but if we then integrate emissions into our simulations, we can also optimize by emissions. So we can generate the lowest emission solution. Usually that's then not the preferred solution or not the solution we recommend, but it's great because in the end, we can show the customer, if you want to focus more on sustainability, these would be the steps compared to now your preferred solution, what you could do better.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's at least a measurement. You can know, rather than have that be just a question out there in the ether. Even if it's not the reason to change, you can at least know where you're starting from with that emissions calculation.
Exactly. And I think there's a lot of going on the market. So, for example, we have seen in the past years a clear rise of green warehouse certifications. Couple of years ago, there were, I mean, these certifications are existing already since a couple of years. But nowadays, almost every new facility, warehouse, logistics facility, which is built, has some kind of a certification. If it's BREEAM, LEED, DGNB, whatever, there are a few out on the market. We don't have to discuss these, but what we see definitely is that most of new facilities have these. And what is really interesting when we then look on the one hand, or when we want to understand why is that the case, of course, that companies, if they own their own facilities and they want to push for sustainability, that's one of the layers where they can go for it. On the other hand, they expect, or they have the expectation that in the future these green warehouse certifications might become so important that if they don't get them now when they build a new building, that their future building will lose a lot of value. So basically, getting these green warehouse certifications to ensure the value of your investment.
Well, of course, and it's easier to do it when you're still building it. You can build all that into the cost of the facility, and it's just easier to do it at the beginning rather than trying to retrofit after the fact, and make something LEED certified or certification, whatever that green certification is. It's easier to do it from the get go. But that's interesting. So we talked about how it's different for the transportation side, but that was really based on carbon emissions. So I know electric vehicles have been also a big topic, and it's a complicated issue. Do you have any other insights that you can share that are different on the transportation side besides just emissions?
So, I mean, in general, when we're talking about sustainability, because nowadays everybody's focusing on climate change and carbon emissions, sustainability is a much broader topic. We usually talk about the 3 Ps, so people, planet, and prosperity. And when we're talking about planet, again, it's not only carbon emissions, there's circular economy, air quality, noise pollution, you name it. There are even more topics. So in general, just to keep that in mind when we're talking about sustainability, of course, the priority or the prioritization is definitely carbon emissions, because that is one of the topics which is really necessary to work on, and it's, let's say, daily within the news. Exactly. It is a big deal. And also within our project, this is what mostly is requested. When we talk about the topic of electrification of transportation, that is definitely one of the key targets where the future might develop towards to. But of course, then there are a few considerations which have to be taken into account. So, for example, is really the electricity which you're consuming with your EV cars or trucks, is that sustainable produced? I mean, if you're then using electricity which comes from fossil fuels again, it doesn't really make a change. So that should be definitely consideration. Also thinking about the grid and the power charging availability. So if you're planning a new DC and you say in the future we want to have e-trucks, you have to take into consideration that you need charging stations. So your docks need high voltage supplies. And so there are a few things to keep in mind for sure.
There are, and not only the availability of clean electricity, but also clean storage for that electricity in those vehicles, those batteries that require, metals and components that are very difficult to pull out of our natural environment and make storage cleaner for those vehicles. I know that it's a very complex issue.
Definitely, it is, and that's also what we see on the market. So let's say if we look at last mile delivery, so urban delivery trucks, their electrification is the clear target. This is a process which is well ongoing. So we see many electrified urban delivery trucks because the battery is also, the payload of the battery is small. With one charge, you usually can make your route. If we then again look at the long distance, long haul transportation, heavy duty trucks, you could get the idea that electrification here is also the long-term solution. It could be one. That's what I'm saying. I'm not saying it is not. But if you look at the bare numbers, so the bare figures which we currently see in the market, this picture is a little bit different. So in Germany, we have every single day around 800,000 trucks rolling through Germany, and above 7.5 tons. So really not any delivery trucks, so only heavy duty trucks. And if we then look at how many of these are currently fully battery powered or hydrogen powered, we come up with around 400 battery powered trucks and 40 hydrogen trucks. So we're talking about less than 0.1% of the total fleet.
That's small.
It is very small. But of course, there are developments ongoing to push that forward. But we will see what the future brings.
So yeah, that is a very small number. I don't know if I necessarily expected that to be higher, because this is going to be a long process of adopting all of these new technologies and making sure that we're choosing the right things for the right reasons and in the right ways, to keep the sustainability and the environmental concerns in place across the entire situation, and not just only in one compartmentalized piece. Like, we have an electric truck, yay. Well, what does that mean for the electric grid or charging, or being able to serve the customer, and all these other considerations? It's going to take time.
Exactly. And if I just can add one point here, I think for urban delivery, it is rather, or electrification can be definitely understood as a solution which covers 90%. But if we're thinking then again about long haul, heavy duty trucks, there is no silver bullet on the market. So electrification can't be the solution for everything. There will be for sure parts where you say definitely electrification can be the right solution, but there are aspects of this transportation or characteristics and types of transportation where other solutions need to come in place as well.
So that's a great point. What drives these requests? Is it that need or that desire to make these changes because of the environment, or is it financially driven? I mean, is it only going to be put into place if there is a financial benefit for that company?
I would say yes and no. So there are, of course, companies who want to really purely green their supply chain. We did projects which had a completely pure green background, which I think is great. But again, then most of the time, it also comes the question regarding the financial benefits. And I have to say that's a very fair point. That's a valid point, because in the end you're doing some investments and you're looking for a payback. And I think that's the great part of it. When you push something, when you push for sustainability, that you then also get some payback in return. So when we say, for example, transportation, you reduce the miles or the mileage which has to be driven. If you reduce the consumption of your truck, You pollute less emissions, but in the end, you also need less money for the transportations because you consume less fuel. That is what we then call the low-hanging fruits, really, where we have an investment and you have a payback. Just think about solar panels on the roof of a facility. Usually we're talking about the amortization period of 10 years, and afterwards you have some kind of free electricity, which I think is great. But then, of course, at some point, we will leave these low-hanging fruits, and then comes the point where companies really need to invest without, or where with a limited payback, let's call it like this. Good that we're still in the early phase, so low-hanging fruits are usually still available.
Right. Everyone's looking for the quick wins to get started, obviously. So you were talking about emission reductions, and we've talked about both transportation and warehousing. They can't have an equal impact, the solar panels on a roof versus an electric vehicle. So should they be treated the same when it comes to, a project in trying to reduce carbon emissions or become more green for these facilities? Or does it have to be a completely separate measurement?
So when we're looking at the supply chain and the emissions along the supply chain, transportation is the much bigger part. Usually we talk about 85% emissions from transportation and 15% from warehousing. So it is quite the comparison. So if a customer says, and if a customer request is that they want to reduce their emissions as much and as fast as possible, the bigger layer can be found in transportation, for sure. That does not mean that we should leave warehousing just by the side, because often companies have outsourced their transportation and still own their own facilities. And then if you have a long-term contract, it's rather hard to push here for emission reduction. Of course, you can sit down with the 3PL, but in the end, they also want to have some investment for a greener fleet. So our recommendation is usually, okay, if you have a new contract, include sustainability requirements in the tendering process. If you have an existing contract and you already want to push for it, of course, I mean, the 3PL is also happy to green their fleet, reduce consumption. But yeah, you have to figure that out and sit down together. But of course, if you want to invest in your own facilities, then warehousing, or if you have own facilities, warehousing is often a good way to start it, because you just have the ownership over these. And what we also have to keep in mind is that even that transportation has or is the bigger layer, so has the higher share of the percentage. These 15% still need to go somehow away, because Germany has the target to be carbon neutral by 2045, the European Union by 2050. So even if you only focus on transportation, you still have to get rid of these emissions from warehousing.
That's true.
And so therefore, the recommendation usually is to look at both parts. Of course, focused maybe a little bit more on transportation, but nevertheless, there are great initiatives also when it comes to carbon reduction in warehousing.
So they need to be treated differently, but the same prioritization. So that makes sense. What are some specific examples of some of these initiatives? I mean, you've talked about the amount they have to reduce, when they have to reduce it by, where we can find those quick wins. What does one of those wins look like? What is something that we can do?
So yeah, for sure. I mean, I mentioned solar panels, which is definitely one of my favorites when we're talking about facilities, because you have such a wide space on these logistics facilities, and it feels to me kind of a waste of space or an untapped potential. You have these huge facilities, and then I don't know, you drive along the highway, and then you see these solar parks where you think, okay, here was a field. And there's the facility maybe just use that space in a better way.
Yes. What about in transportation? Is there anything that seems like that no brainer? Why aren't we already doing this?
I think the What we do here within Miebach most of the time is this logistics system design. So we try to reduce the need for transportation, so really reduce the mileage which the truck has to go, because we optimize the transportation flows. And that includes, for example, also freight modal shifts, so push something on rail, vehicle routing and scheduling, getting something out of that. But often in our projects, or at least in the network design projects, the sustainability analysis ends there. And then for me, there comes this more operational perspective where there's also a lot of untapped potential. You don't have to exchange your entire fleet with hydrogen or electric trucks. There are also a lot of intermediate steps which can be taken. Sustainable driver training is definitely one of the topics which is underrated on the market, because the person who's driving the truck has such a big impact on the fuel consumption.
That's a great point.
And then you can support this training with monitoring the performance of the truck. So not telling your employee he's did something wrong or false, but just he can the drivers then can understand in a better way what was good and what was bad during the drive. Maintenance or also new technologies. I guess everybody knows the overcap spoiler of a truck. For the aerodynamics, but there are so many other different opportunities to make your trailer more aerodynamic and thereby reduce the fuel consumption.
So it comes down to back to what I know we have always worked toward is just efficiency and processes, and looking at what that status quo is and how can we improve it. And just by making some of those small improvements that we would have recommended anyway, there is an aspect of sustainability that can be achieved through those changes and those quick wins.
Definitely. And there are also then some solutions which I think are really interesting in transportation, which are then a little bit more situation specific. So, for example, I know from a company in Berlin, which is now fueling their trucks with HVO, so hydrotreated vegetable oil. So that's basically a waste product from cooking, and which is great. But of course, what we have to understand there is it has a limited scalability. So these are solutions which fit for some companies here and there, and it's great to see them on the market. I love these innovations. But yeah, if we're looking then on the big picture, we can't drive. Not everybody can drive with recycled cooking oil. Then we need to have to scale up the cooking a lot.
So as a former restaurant manager, I do have some experience on the other side of that in collecting and maintaining that used oil storage. And you're right. It's not an overall blanket solution for every instance. For every company, it's not going to work for everyone, because we just don't eat that much fried food. It's not good for us either. And we shouldn't start eating fried food just so we can make oil for these vehicles to reclaim. That defeats the entire purpose. But it's good to look creatively at the different things that we do in our life that can be put toward this overall goal of making sure that we're using everything available to us and not just filling up landfills or dumping things. But one thing you had mentioned earlier was that there is a financial aspect to this. And when it comes to these smaller companies that may be a great fit for utilizing this reclaimed fuel, it's not scalable, so it has to be a small thing. Are there still financial benefits for those? Is it a smart business choice to maybe forego some of those financial benefits in the one area in order to achieve a sustainability goal in another?
There are for sure financial benefits coming out of that. I don't know the business case of the particular example I just mentioned, but there are a ton of initiatives where if they are suitable only for a certain niche, or if they are suitable for the bigger picture along the logistics companies around the globe, there are a lot of initiatives which have a financial benefit. I mean, if you're looking at if you're looking at warehousing, I mentioned already solar panels. That would be then the side of producing your own electricity. But of course, the other aspects or the other views would be reducing the demand for energy. And we see that a lot. So easy examples like LED lighting, movement sensors, so you don't need to have the lights all the time within
We
the
have those.
warehouse. Yeah, roof lights. Again, here then comes a little bit the target conflict. You want to use the sunlight for lighting, but then again, you have to arrange it around with the solar panels, which you should put on the roof.
So many things going on up on the roof.
Exactly. Insulation of the building. So if you have to heat or cool the building, of course it is investment, and then you will reduce the energy demand for heating or cooling. But in the end, this has a nice payback for sure.
Well, and this goes back to what we were talking about earlier with, as facilities are being built, whether it's owned or whether it's by a 3PL, all of these things need to be taken into consideration. And it makes me chuckle because, that was built into warehouse design from the get-go years, half a century ago, when they were building warehouses, they didn't have electricity, widely available all over the world in every place that there needed to be a warehouse. So that's why we have that iconic design of, warehouses that have that little triangular symbol at the top of them. That was because that's the way they designed the roofs to allow light in. And
yeah, for sure.
then when you look further into, heating and cooling, well, are we facing the sun? Is that letting in too much light? Does it need to be ambient or direct? Are we able to capture wind to be able to utilize that to, cool anything within the building, whether it's, the atmosphere or just harnessing the power of wind? I know turbines are another option that a lot of geographies utilize. It's very big here in the Midwest of the United States. We have lots of wind farms because we're just flat. There's nothing happening in the landscape, and we can harness that wind energy that we get. Heaven forbid there's a tornado; those things go berserk. But those are all things, and they're not new. Windmills have been around for centuries, so they're not new concepts, but we're utilizing them in different ways to achieve different things. And I think it's just going in a great direction. So when companies start doing these things now and going back to, older technologies and utilizing the earth and the environment and our weather to help power their organizations, are they expected to go this extra mile in the carbon reduction based on their own intrinsic morality or motivation, or should they cave to social pressures? Or, what is the motivation to go behind just that quick win, those low hanging fruit, and really dig in and make significant changes to their operations?
So in a perfect world, you would say the social responsibility should be sufficient to make these moves. I would leave that answer to philosophers to answer. But coming back to the real world, so some early adopters or some companies might have this intrinsic motivation, but I think for the most of them, legislation and governments needs to step in to make this push towards sustainability development beyond the low-hanging fruits. And that is also what is taking place already. So we see some regulations which are pushing companies, but in my expectation will be that there's coming a lot more. So for example, we have now, it's not finalized yet, but it's in discussion, and it's already quite longer in discussion. So the status is already quite good. We have in Europe now this smart solar panel directive, where then if you build a new commercial or public building, solar panels are a requirement on the building if certain aspects come in place. So if it's above 250 square meters and so on. And then within the coming years, it should also be applied to already existing buildings. So basically, a lot of logistic warehouses will need to install solar panels on their roofs. Of course, if, for example, the statics don't work out, this does not apply. But just to have that one example here, that's something that there are regulations already in place. But as I said before, for the EU, we have this binding target. So it's not that the EU said we want to do this, but they said, okay, we have to do this by 2050, carbon neutrality of the EU. So there will be the need for a lot of new legislation, new regulations to push companies towards these ambitious goals.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. And as I spoke about, when I mentioned that I'd spoken with Anastasia about this last year, it's a leveling of the playing field. When one company is doing it because of their own motivation internally, that's wonderful. But then, there are other companies that can try to get by without it and cut costs elsewhere. And it really does make a difference to raise everyone up to the same level at the same time, at least whatever that baseline is going to be, whether it's, carbon neutral by 2050, which is lofty.
Yeah, definitely. And what you just said just is fitting exactly in the idea of this European emission trading system, which we already have for example, the electricity sector. And now in 2027, it's going to be extended also for transportation sector within Europe. And what is that? Is you basically pay some kind of a carbon tax. Exactly. But the nice thing about it is, so it is based on a cap and trade principle. So the total for every emission which you pollute, you have to buy an allowance, not yourself, but the companies who bringing the fuel into the market. So in the end, fuel is just getting more expensive, for example. And the total amount of allowances is set by the EU. So this is everything which can be emitted from pollutants, and then this cap is reduced every single year by a reduction factor, and the price for one of these allowances is then generated through auctions. So the companies need to pay for these allowances, and the idea behind is, as we reduce the cap every single year, it is expected that the cost per allowance, so the cost per ton of CO2, is also increasing. And the idea behind this is really, okay, either you reduce your emissions or you pay somebody else to reduce the emissions, because the total amount of emissions are reducing every single year. There's no way to stop that. So somebody has to take action, and either you pay more or you do it yourself, which I think is great, just to include everybody. Of course, in a perfect world, we wouldn't need that, but yeah, I think legislation is necessary to push companies for these last steps.
Well, and I did say that the 2050 goal of carbon neutrality for the EU, correct, it's lofty. It's bold, and I like it. But is it realistic? Is it too fantastical, or is it actually possible to do all of this change and make all of these adjustments within that time frame? Or are some companies just going to be held back because there just isn't the time or the capital to be able to put these projects into place, and so they're going to be penalized just because we're trying so hard to do something so fast?
It's a little bit the question, what should be the alternative, Alan? Because I mean, climate change is then again not saying, yeah, of course we know it was a short time to adapt. So of course we need companies to make that move within the shorter time. Um, I totally agree. It is very ambitious, 2050, and there's a lot of things which need to happen. But I also think that the governments are there not alone, because a lot of companies have agreed to science-based targets. So they have committed also themselves to become carbon neutral by 2050, to reduce emissions by 2030, 2040. So they really committed to climate targets, and that's all publicly available. And I think there is very interesting development will come within the next years, because a lot of big companies agreed on these science-based targets and stated and marketed these. Okay, by 2030 we will do X and Y. By 2040 we will do Z. And now we're moving closer to 2030, and now also that's what we see from the market. The reaction is, okay, we have this 2030 goal. What can we actually do to get there? And then we're back with the logistics sustainable initiatives, where we say, okay, if we're looking at the supply chain, these should be the things which you should do.
Sure. So it is ambitious. I like your word, but it also opens up the opportunity for innovation, I think is what I hear you saying. That yes, we know that there's this penalty or this benchmark that we have to hit because there's a regulation, but that means we have to get creative about how we fix it and how we get there.
It is ambitious. I don't think there's an alternative. And I like how you said it. It opens up a lot of opportunities for innovation and really changing the way how the companies are operating, and also how we consuming, for sure. So we're also part of the problem and the solution.
Exactly. We can be part of the problem and the solution. We can recognize where we are not being the best stewards of our planet and make a conscious decision to do better and to change and to consider other ideas.
Yeah, definitely. I read that quote. There are no passengers on spaceship Earth, which I really like, because in the end it means, you can't be just a passenger. Everybody has to act. So you just can't sit there and say somebody else is doing it for you. Also us, and also all the companies, they need to adapt to more sustainable operations.
I love that. That's fantastic. So one of the things that you got excited about earlier was the solar panels on roofs, just because it makes so much sense. I totally agree. And I will say, in Indianapolis, which I'm sure you recall, there are solar fields out next to our airport where you have to have a lot of, open area in order for planes to take off. You don't want a house directly underneath there. So where we have space, we have solar panels, but a lot of companies are doing that on roofs now. But what are some of your favorite sustainability practices that are being put into place in facilities other than solar panels?
I think for warehousing, one of the easiest and fastest way to reduce your emission footprint is really just to ensure to procure 100% of green electricity. And if you just consume renewable energy, that should be the first step. Then second step, again, bringing in the solar panels. You just depend on others to produce the green electricity. You have that untapped potential, roof space, whatever. Of course, you can also be part of the solution and produce the electricity, the renewable electricity.
All right. No, that makes total sense. And so this is a very strange aside, but that was one of my requirements when my husband and I purchased a new house a few years ago. Solar panels are not big on residential structures in the United States, or at least in our area of it. They're not very popular. And a lot of it has to do with aesthetics. Now, when we're talking about a large commercial property, on the roof, it doesn't matter. No one cares. No one's coming into your building because they thought it was so pretty. But when you're looking at a an individual home for a person, it looks different. And I insisted that our house face a certain direction so that when, and not if, but when we want to install solar panels and when it makes sense to do so, it would be on the back of the house. So you don't see it from the front. And some of my friends thought that that was just a ridiculous condition to put on, looking at real estate and considering which houses to buy. And I thought, no, this is important to me, that I need resale value on a real estate investment. So obviously I don't necessarily want them on the front elevation of the roof, but the back elevation, that's important to me, that we could use that in order to generate some of our own electricity through a solar panel. So that's strange aside. I'm sorry.
No, you're fine. You're fine. And if I can add one thing, which just crossed my mind, of course, one of the other aspects which we're focusing on when we're looking at warehousing is basically phasing out of fossil fuel consumption. Because if you're dependent on MHE equipment in which is still using petrol or diesel, whatever, there's no way to reduce the emissions from that side. So phasing these out and use electrified MHE outside of your warehouse. I hope you don't use them inside anyhow. And again, if you think further, if you have a gas-based heating, of course, you can also move towards electricity-based heating and cooling. This, again, has a requirement that the electricity which is used is renewable. Otherwise, this move doesn't make sense. And then there are a lot of cool innovations on the market where you have certain insulation or cooling systems which are then based on chemical and physical reactions and are not requiring any energy.
Yeah, any external energy source to power those things. So do you have a client use case or a story that you can share?
Of course. It would be sad if I if I wouldn't have to share anything being part of our Center of Excellence for Sustainability. What do you want to hear, warehousing or transportation? Okay, I pick. I think I'm going to pick warehousing because I think that was really interesting. So this was for a client who from consumer goods industry and with a lot of warehouses around Europe. So we're talking about a few hundred warehouses. And they approached us and say, okay, we want to make them more green. And of course, we can't just look at 500 warehouses individually, or we can, but it will take quite a long time. And they wanted to have some fast results. So what we did for them was, first of all, of course, we had to understand the business, how it worked for them. Operations are always a little bit different, especially when you think about different countries, different climate zones in which these warehouses were based, and what went through these warehouses, so the products. But in the end, what we did was we developed a methodology for the client to identify for each of these 500 warehouses based on certain characteristics, what should be the first priority steps to reduce emissions from these warehouses.
So it really was looking at some of those benchmarks and looking at different metrics for each of those warehouses rather than just saying, okay, you need solar panels on every warehouse. That could be, expensive with hundreds of warehouses and all of those arrays and installation and maintenance. That's a huge deal. So it comes down to the individual facility and knowing what to look at.
Exactly, but not in the part that we looked at every of these 500 warehouses individually, but we built up this methodology where this recommendation, and I think we included 30 different sustainable initiatives within warehousing. So where with the certain characteristics, when we need some input, of course, from each warehouse, but if they included, the recommendation comes out, okay, what should be your first steps? I mean, you probably don't need a lot of heating if you have a warehouse in southern Spain. and then it's not a big deal to move from gas-based heating on electrified heating.
That's fantastic, because I know one of the larger statements when it comes to sustainability initiatives or green, thinking is that, individuals. My example about our own home, me using a solar panel on my roof is going to make a very small dent in the overall electricity usage in my community. But if large facilities do it and start doing it, it's going to make a large impact. And so we need these large companies to take the lead, because they do utilize so many of these resources that we have. And if they can make a change to make it more sustainable, more carbon neutral, it's going to make a much larger impact than even if my entire community, were to put solar panels on our roof. It's just a matter of scale.
Definitely, but I also have to disagree in some way that I think companies have to do it, but also we ourselves. So I always say, be the change you want to see in the world. So it's not just, it is easy to say somebody else has to do it for us. We also have to play our part.
True. Yes. It does not absolve the individual of needing to participate in these things. As you pointed out, there are no passengers on this planet. So we do need to do our part, and we need these companies to do their part as well. And I am so glad that there are these types of initiatives in place, because honestly, it fuels the innovation. And that is what is so exciting and interesting. We're not going to find a one fix all solution. So we need all those creative minds out there thinking of new ways to be more sustainable, to be a better steward for our planet, and to come up with better ideas to do what we need to do and what we want to do, and still be that leader of the change and a steward of our planet.
Definitely. We'll 100% agree here.
Thank you for joining me today. I hope our listeners learned as much as I did, because I learned a lot today. If any of our listeners out there have a suggestion for a topic or would like to be a guest on this show, we'd love to hear from you. Please contact me at podcast@miebach.com. As always, thank you for listening to Speaking of Supply Chain. If you enjoyed our show, please rate and review us on whatever podcast platform you prefer. We are on Google Podcasts, which is actually now YouTube audio, or YouTube. I believe it's YouTube audio. So we are available on YouTube audio. We do have YouTube video content that has some additional get to know you conversations with our guests. So if you are only an audio listener on Spotify or Apple Podcasts, you should come and take a look at our YouTube channel and see what we have there, because there's some additional content you may have missed out on. As always, thank you for listening to Speaking of Supply Chain. Be sure to tune in next time.